Is May 16th, 2008. My name is Rosalind Benjet. I'm here for the Dallas Jewish Historical Society to record the oral history of Ron Mankoff. And our videographer is Ruth Andrus. Ron, tell us about your family.
My family in Minneapolis were my folks. My mother and father both came from Russia, and I had an older sister who still lives in Minneapolis, and her family lives there. Mm-hmm. And I grew up in a very loving and a reasonably Jewish family, I would say. Mm-hmm. Came to Dallas in 1959 and created my new family with joy.
Right. How did your parents happen to get to Minneapolis?
My father's older brother had come some years earlier and started a chain of general stores in North and South Dakota. And he and his brothers-in-law had a chain of stores, and when my father was old enough to come over, I think he was about 15, he came with his mother and sisters, and the logical place to come for an education was Minneapolis, because the Dakotas didn't have any major cities. So he went to high school in Minneapolis, and then started college, and then went in the Army. It was about 1917 at that time, and spent a couple of years in the Army, and then left the Army in order to go back to Europe. Actually, his mother did not come with him. He went back to Europe to bring his mother and relatives after his Army service. A very exciting story, because after he made the first trip and brought back his mother and some relatives, the word got out that Harry Mankoff can go to Europe and bring your relatives back. And it was widely known, and so he was solicited to go back. And all in all, the story goes, he brought 150 people from Europe to the United States and to Minneapolis.
This would have been in the early 20s?
Mm-hmm. Yes, that's right. Shortly after the war. Mm-hmm. He traveled in his uniform, and he had letters from the Army and from senators saying that he was authorized to go over there and bring these people over. Mm-hmm. It was a very interesting story, and people would stop him on the street and thank him for bringing them over, or their parents over. It was a wonderful story. My father lived to be 101, and right up through his last birthday party, when he was 100, people came and told the story about how he had brought their parents over from Europe. Mm-hmm. He and his family worked in South Dakota, where I was born, in 1931, until about 32, when there was a drought. And so all of the farmers were unable to pay their bills, and the stores were unable to continue. My dad initially went to California, and they lived with my mother's sister, whose husband had a furniture store in Pasadena, California, and they stayed there for about a year, and then came back to Minneapolis, where my dad went in the insurance business, which was a connection that his nephews had. They were all selling insurance for Metropolitan Life Insurance Company in Minneapolis, and he came back and went to work for Metropolitan, stayed there for 30 years, and then retired and started his life as a real estate investor. Had a very nice life.
And what was Minneapolis like when you were a child living there?
Very cold. Very cold place. Minneapolis was it was restricted. It was somewhat anti-Semitic, I think, in those days. It was a very conservative town. There were Jewish law firms and really no Jews in the non-Jewish law firms. There was a Jewish neighborhood where I grew up on the north side, and but it's developed over the years, and it's opened and warmed. But right through the time when I was practicing law there, and right after law school, I did practice law for a year and a half in Minneapolis. It was with a Jewish law firm, and I think since that time it has opened up. And in that period, individual Jews would go and practice with the white shoe law firm, so to speak. But it took some years for that to happen. It's a very conservative community in those days.
Tell us about your experiences in school in Minneapolis, and then
I went to grade school and high school in Minneapolis, a place called North High, which was about, I think it was 1/3 Jewish, 1/3 black, and 1/3 WASP. And a very good school, a very bright school, a very large student body. I don't think it's not in that location anymore. The north side has turned rather rough over the years. Then from Minneapolis, I went on to the University of Minnesota, where I had my undergraduate and law degree. I graduated there in 1954 and went in the Navy. I'd been on a Navy ROTC program, which basically paid for my law school. But required me to go on summer cruises. And that brought me south to Dallas, where I visited my aunt and uncle, Jerry and Emma Sue Frank, on the way to Orange, Texas, where we did a summer cruise one year. And I really loved Dallas. That was, it seemed to me that people down here knew how to live. Nobody had to shovel snow. And everybody grew flowers, and it was just a lovely place to live. When I graduated law school in 1954, I went in the Navy, spent 3 years, met Joy, came back to Minneapolis after the 3 years and went to work for a firm called Leonard Street and Dinard. And they were, notwithstanding the names, they were all Jewish. And practiced there for about 1.5 years, and then decided it was time to go court Joy, who was still living in New York. And so I left to go to NYU tax law school. NYU Law School had a tax program in those days, and it still does. So I went out there and took the tax program for 9 months, and we got engaged, and then moved to Dallas. I intentionally didn't pick up the phone. The reason I had planned to come to Dallas initially, but when I got off the ship, the phone rang, and it was my mother. She said she had got a call from this lawyer who really wanted to know when I was coming back because he wanted to offer me a job. And so I had to go back to Minneapolis under that circumstance, and did, and went to work. But the second time I didn't answer the phone. I went directly to Dallas because I really wanted to go south.
Well, let's go back to your childhood and Jewish affiliations that your family had.
I'm sorry, what was that?
Let's talk, can we talk about Jewish affiliations that your family had in Minneapolis?
Well, let's see. When I started, we lived just down the street from an Orthodox synagogue, Mikra Kodesh it was called, and that's where my Boy Scout troop was. And I sang in they had a little choir, for high holidays, because they had the virtuosic cantor. And that was our connection. Then we moved, and we were now closer to a conservative synagogue. And so we became members of Bethel. And that's where I was bar mitzvahed. Jewish affiliation, I would say it was Temple Synagogue. My mother and sister were very active in Hadassah. My sister was on the national board, and my mother was very active and was the Hadassah Woman of the Year one year, certainly in Minneapolis. And I belonged to a Jewish fraternity, ZBT, at the university. And that was probably the extent of our Jewish affiliation.
What made you decide to study law?
Well, I thought it was good preparation for general living. I initially didn't think I didn't really plan to be a lawyer, but I thought you had to do something. And I thought going through law school was a good idea. I didn't like the sight of blood, so I wasn't going to be a doctor. At one time I was thinking about being an architect, but then I found out architects didn't get paid very well. And I was thinking about being a rabbi at one point, but that sort of went away very quickly. And what was left was law school. And so that was it. Off we went to law school, and then I enjoyed it, and it turned out that I had learned a skill and a trade, and it was something that I liked doing, so I decided to, and I practiced. I enjoyed it very much.
And how did you enjoy meat?
Well, I was on a ship called the Randall, which was a troop transport that carried Marine troops, and we were stationed in Norfolk, Virginia. And the ship had been loaned out to Universal International to make a movie called Away All Boats, which was a story about a troop transport that had been attacked in the Pacific and crippled, and all of its boats had been used to pull it around. It was a very sort of touching story. And so the Randall was sent to the Virgin Islands, which is where they made the movie. And the first night we got off, the officers went to the bar at the Virgin Isle Hotel, and I was sitting there, and a young lady went by with an older gentleman, and I turned to the fellow next to me and I said, "Isn't it a shame that these older guys bring these young girls down here?" And about half an hour later, a woman came over and she said, "I am the social hostess or social director of the hotel. Would you like to meet a young lady who's here with her family? Have a drink with them?" And I said, "Sure." So I went over, and there was Joy sitting in a booth with her father and her mother. It turned out this was her father. Her mother was late. And Joy was and still is, a very beautiful girl. Very slender, dark hair, blue eyes, and wonderfully opinionated. I was from Minneapolis, and in Minneapolis everybody sort of had unspecific opinions. We would sort of go along. Joy had very strong opinions about everything, and she was well educated, bright, and we danced, and I fell in love. And so the next day I went to my captain, and I said, "Can I get the weekend off? I want to move into the hotel and date this girl." And he said, "Fine." So I did, and we spent the weekend dining and dancing and swimming, and just had a wonderful time. And that's how I met Joy.
Mm-hmm. It's a lovely story. When you did move to Dallas, what was the city like?
It's wonderfully small, very friendly, uncrowded. It was hot, but dry. It seemed drier in those days than it is now. But the people were just lovely. It had a combination of the Southeast, where people were gracious and elegant, and the Southwest, where they were warm and welcoming. Mm-hmm. And when we came, we just sort of fell into home. Mm-hmm. So we'd always been here.
What were you doing professionally when you first moved here?
Well, when I first came down, this was before we married, I came down and I got a job offer with a particular firm and went back up to Hartford, got engaged, came back down here, and the offer fell through. It didn't happen. So we put the wedding off from June to November. And then I looked around to spend another 6 weeks, found another job with a very nice law firm called Lyon Blanchett Smith & Shelton. Although I will say they had an interesting comment. They said they had never hired a Jewish lawyer before because Jewish lawyers tend not to stay. And sure enough, about a year later, I left. But the circumstances were rather typical. I had been fortunate enough to bring in a lot of good business. My Uncle Jerry had a tax case, and I was able to bring in business that paid for my salary and quite a bit more. And about a year later, the firm that I had originally wanted to go with, a fellow named Wentworth T. Durant and Robert J. Hobby, Durant and Hobby, who did exactly what I wanted to do. They were tax litigators. They had not had a job opportunity when I first came. They approached me after a year and said, "We now have business, we'd like you to come with us." And I said, "That's swell. How much does the job pay?" And he said, "It's not a job, it's a partnership." I said, "Wonderful, wow." Well, it turned out that Hobby had cancer, and they were interested in continuing the firm so that Hobby's widow could be paid out. and I was going to be the continuation of the firm, and it became Durant, Hobby, and Mankoff in 1961, I guess, and stayed in iterations of that for about 20 some odd years until 1983, when we merged with a fellow named Bryce, and it became Bryce and Mankoff. But that was the association. That's where I practiced. Wonderful practice went Durant. Bob Hobby died 6 months after we joined together, but Durant and I practiced for 20 odd years, and then he died at the age of 77. And the firm went on practicing good tax law, good corporate law, business law for a long time.
And you've been involved in the Jewish community for a very long time. How did you get started, and what did you do?
Well, I went on the board of the temple sometime early. I joined the temple and joined the country club when we first got here. Joined the North Dallas Chamber of Commerce, and joined a lot of things, the sort of things that lawyers do. And I was on the temple board for a number of years and was reasonably active. And at one point, the leadership of the temple sort of slid to younger people. And I was nominated president and became a president of Temple when I was about 47, I think 46, 47 years old. And I'll take it back. Before that, I had been president of American Jewish Committee, which was another group that I had joined and was active in. I think those were my two main interests and activities. Then after Temple, I went on the board of the Union of American Hebrew Congregations, which was the national organization of Reformed congregations. That was partly because the Temple Manual had dropped out of the Union for several years because there was a controversy about how much dues we were being asked to pay and whether it was fair. And in the absence of negotiation success, Temple Manual just dropped out and went on its own. And it was during that period that I became, I think I was president when we went back in. And as part of the deal, 2 or 3 of us went on the board of the union. And I think Lonnie Pollock was one, and I was another, and can't remember the third. And so I was on the union board for another 18 years, which was a nice Jewish activity. What else have I done? I'm sure there are others. Doesn't jump into mind.
Okay. What is the favorite project that you've worked on, though, during over all the years that you've been involved?
Probably the Dallas Toll Road, called Daddy's Toll Road. This was actually an earlier activity than either the AJC or Temple. I'd been in Dallas practicing for a couple of years, and it seemed to me that it was time to get active in something communal, and I said that to Joy. And in the newspaper, there was a little blurb about somebody at the North Dallas Chamber of Commerce, a fellow who was an architect, who announced that they were forming a group to oppose the North Dallas Toll Road because it was not as represented. The toll road in all of the publicity and early pictures was going to be a submerged road that nobody would see because it was going right along the railroad track and through some very nice neighborhoods. And when the plans finally came out, it turned out that it was going to be overpasses going through all these neighborhoods with high concrete bridges going along, and there was a consternation in North Dallas. So I called this fellow at the North Dallas Chamber, and I said, because I had been to some of those meetings, and I said, I'm a lawyer and I'd be glad to help you if I can, and you may have some legal issues. And he said, that'd be fine. He called me back and said, would you be president? He said, it turned out the North Dallas Chamber didn't want to be on the other side of that issue because they thought the road would be good for the community. So he couldn't do it because he was a director, but could I be the president of the North Dallas Homeowners Association? Had set up exactly for this purpose, which I agreed to do. And we had some lovely meetings, wonderful meetings, and we all agreed that we would oppose this and we would, through negotiation. We did have some hotheads in the organization who wanted to sue at all costs. Sue them, stop the project, but cooler heads prevailed, and we agreed that we didn't want to stop the project, we just wanted a better project. And so, as a matter of fact, at one point, what made it all very exciting was my office was downtown, and I was walking by a building that housed the Central Business District Association, which was one of the entities very involved in this operation. And just on a whim, I walked into their office, and there were about a dozen people having a meeting. And I looked in, I turned around, walked out. They said, "Wait a minute, aren't you the fellow who was involved with the North Dallas homeowners?" And I said, "Yes." Well, he said, "Come on in. We want to work this out." And they did. And what we negotiated was that the city was which was getting several $100,000 for part of the land that was going to be used for the toll road, agreed that they would contribute that money to pay for the additional cost of underpasses, because underpasses are, a submerged road would cost more. And the Turnpike Authority agreed to pay, and the result was that we ended up with 6 out of 8 underpasses, so that the streets at Walnut Hill and Park Lane are underpass, and Forest Lane are underpasses rather than overpasses. 2 of them remained. One of them may be Forest, one of them was Lover's Lane because of drainage problems. But I felt very good about that. This was a solution to a problem through discourse and negotiation rather than brute force. Since that time, I've been the chairman of other homeowner associations dealing primarily with the Nasher property just north of where we live. Mm-hmm. And we negotiated, in that case, a successful shopping center alternative to the high-rise office park that he had proposed. Mm-hmm. It's called Lincoln Park, and everybody's very happy with it now. Mm-hmm. Except the late Mr. Nasher, I'm sure. He wasn't particularly happy.
He wasn't happy about that. How do you think the city's changed since you first came to live in Dallas?
Well, it's become a lot bigger, a lot more complex. When I first got here, there were individuals who were dedicated to the good of the city who could get things done. They were called an oligarchy. Another aspect of my activity was at one time I was part of a young leadership group that Eric Johnson had put together. And I think I was drafted partly from the North Dallas Homeowners Association. And we were assigned out to different organizations, and I was assigned out to the Citizens Charter Association, which at that time was the political oligarchy in town. And it would nominate people to the city council because it did not have single member districts, and it would pay for an advertising campaign. And by and large, their candidates won, although not always. And it was this oligarchy was run by people who were dedicated to the good of the city. And over the years, we've seen some of them. But I think one of the major changes we've seen has been the introduction of political leadership rather than community leadership. With the result that you get the feeling that perpetuating their position in office is more important than getting something done for the good of the city. I think that's been a major change. Now, every once in a while we see somebody come back. I'm very impressed with Mayor Leppert, although we didn't support him for mayor. I think he's one of the people who is of that ilk, who sees something to be done for the city and wants it to be done rather than simply running for mayor or running for higher office. That's been a major change in the city. We're very fortunate that a lot of things got done. The airport, for example, would not have gotten done except for the individual effort of Eric Johnson, who put his own money up to option land and kept it secret, so he accumulated a large enough area that could be an airport without the price getting out of hand. And so the result is Dallas is now in the center of the city and served by a wonderful airport, without which it couldn't possibly have prospered as it did. Other individuals have done that, but mostly for their own benefit, and very few for the benefit of the city.
How about the Jewish community? How's that changed?
It's gotten awfully big. You know, there was a time when you thought you knew everybody in town. You know, 50 or 48 years ago when we first came here. It's a very big, very diverse community. I think it's done a wonderful job of taking care of its own, of representing itself in the larger community. One of the nice things Temple Emmanuel always did was to be part of the larger community. And I think the Jews in Dallas have always prided themselves on being active participants in the political life and the charitable life and the intellectual life of the city. And I think they're doing that well, continue to do it. I'm very proud of the Jewish community in Dallas, Texas. I don't think there's anything that's happened that has not been well done, well thought out. Whether it's the new legacy, which I think is a beautiful project, the projects the National Council of Jewish Women does, which are outreach and programs to help the larger community. I think those things are very important. I think they're well done.
Mm-hmm. And what are you doing now?
What am I doing now in the community?
Well, both then and
Oh,
professionally.
by and large, I'm relaxing. I'm playing golf and I'm playing bridge and I'm building furniture and we're traveling quite a bit. We do a little. I'm on the board of the High Investment Finance Committee, the Endowment Finance Committee, which takes a little bit of my time. I'm still on I was chairman of the foundation of the Jewish Federation, as it was called at that time, so I'm still on that board, and I guess I always will be, and I'm still on the board of Temple, and I guess I always will be. And I'm active in a couple of groups that are involved in Reform Judaism and what it should be, whether it should be the classical reform, progressive Reform Judaism, thoughts about Judaism. Reform Judaism has changed over the years, and that's an area of my interest and concern.
Mm-hmm. Did you have role models?
Role models?
During your career?
I say this, but not really.
Mm-hmm.
No, I've always felt very lucky that where I was and what I was doing was very satisfying to me on an individual and personal basis. And I wasn't, now Went Durant was a mentor of mine, and I would say that his standards were high and his intellectual ability was enormous, and but we were comrades rather than, he wasn't a role model in the strictest sense. He smoked cigars and I didn't want to smoke cigars. But I've always been very fortunate in that the paths that I've taken seem to have led well. We've been very lucky that way.
Mm-hmm. And tell us about your family today.
Well, Joy is relaxing with me, although she's much more active than I am, I think. All of the organizations that she has created or participated in are still quite active, and she's active in them. My son Jeff is here, and we office together and hug every day. He's got a wonderful family, a boy and a girl. And my son Douglas out in California is in the movie business, has 3 children, and they're all living happy, productive lives. We're very very happy. We look around and we're very pleased at what we have had and what we look to have in the future.
Is there anything that you would like to add?
I'm glad you're here today.
Thank you.
We are too.
We are too. Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Are we in time?
No, oh yeah.